Now, let me begin by suggesting to you how the theme of education connects in ways that are both obvious and non-obvious with the topics we've been discussing in the course. Let's go back to one of the most persistent themes in the arguments of the course, which is the construction of a knowledge economy for the many. And let me remind you of the fundamental difference between the present productive vanguard, this knowledge economy, in an insular form, and the past vanguard, the vanguard that has replaced conventional industry, also known as Fordist mass production. Now remember what the past vanguard was. This vanguard that I'm calling conventional industry. It was the large-scale production of standardized goods and services with relatively rigid machines and production processes on the basis of semi-skilled labor and very hierarchical and highly specialized relations of production, the technical division of labor. And this productive vanguard was fabulously successful. It was the basis for the recipe, for the formula of rapid development promoted by development economics for 50 or 70 years. It was supposed to allow any country, if it did the right things, to converge rapidly to the global vanguard. And thus one of its cardinal attributes was said to be unconditional convergence, meaning unconditional convergence to the vanguard. It had many attractions. First of all, it produced tradable goods, tradables, which in turn produced hard currency. Second, it consisted in a very stereotyped repertoire of machines and practices, which, as it were, could be embarked on an airplane and taken from one country to another with almost no context, and all of a sudden you had a magic formula for rapid economic growth. And third, although it did have so-called requirements, which were called the fundamentals, these requirements were in fact minimal. Now, what were the fundamentals? The fundamentals were institutions and education. But the requirement for the fundamentals were minimal. So institutions, that there had to be a professional state with a state bureaucracy. And in the state bureaucracy, there would be places for the economists, for the planners, who would organize this process of unconditional convergence under the rubric of conventional industry. The second requirement was education. And an enormous amount was said about education. An enormous amount of lip service was paid to education as a requirement. But in fact, very little significant education was needed from the workers in the model of conventional industry. The only real requirements were elementary numeracy and literacy that allowed workers to read, hear, or understand basic orders or instructions. Second, rudimentary physical dexterity, Now compare this to the contemporary vanguard, the insular knowledge economy, which excludes the vast majority of workers in a firm. It doesn't have a stereotyped set of practices and machines. The machines can be radically reprogrammed in the process of being used. And to reprogram them, you have to already reimagine the process of production. The new vanguard combines the characteristics of craft production and mass production. From Fordist industrial mass production, it takes production at scale, and from craft production, it takes the ability to de-standardize. Now, remember my discussion of the false idea that there's an imminent logic of technological evolution. So that once we get on this escalator, for example, with respect to artificial intelligence, we really can't get off it. It has a pre-established direction. And I attacked that idea and defended instead another idea, which is that there's no intrinsic logic of technological evolution. And I then contrasted the idea of the intrinsic logic with this alternative idea at 3 moments of time. So the first moment you would suppose, according to the thesis of the imminent logic of technological evolution, that technology will and must develop in a form that lends itself to the operations of the largest firms, and they can therefore be internalized by these businesses that have vast amounts of liquid capital. The alternative view in the short run is that the most important targets or beneficiaries of this technological uplift in the first stage are 2. First of all, the relatively backward small and medium-sized firms of the peripheral economy. And second, the vast multitude of individualized economic agents who are purveyors of services or small commerce and have no stable relations to any business organization. Those are the 2 most important agents. So it's completely different. They're not in the formal economy often, and they have to be almost created or aroused ex nihilo. Now, in the second stage, the contrast is between the idea that the natural vocation of the knowledge economy is to serve as a master instrument of automation to replace labor. The alternative idea is that the replacement of labor is always a possibility, but it's not the natural or necessary or preferred outcome. The preferred outcome is the empowerment and equipment of the worker, not the simple replacement of the worker by the machine. And the alternative to automation is no less sophisticated, technologically and scientifically demanding than automation. On the contrary, it's more complicated and more demanding. And in the long term, the third stage, the contrast appears with respect to the view of what the commanding goal of this process is with respect to artificial intelligence. The necessitarian view, the view that there is an intrinsic logic to technological evolution, takes the form of the idea that the goal is so-called general artificial intelligence. And general artificial intelligence is imagined as the production of a machine that simulacrum of the human mind. It's not just going to replace the worker, it's going to replace the mind. The opposing view is that the mind cannot be replaced by a machine. And that the goal of the process is the creation of a form of artificial intelligence that is radically different from the human mind. The more different it is, the better. And that precisely because it is radically different from the human mind, it can serve the human mind. So what is imagined then is a partnership between the machine with vast computational powers which we cannot aspire to imitate, and the human being with imagination, who is always looking to create possibilities or transformations in the space of the adjacent possible. That's the objective. And the theme of the imagination runs throughout the course in every respect. Just let me remind you of one of the other ways in which it runs through the course. I've claimed at several key points in the argument that there are three fundamental problems on which social theory has focused or begun to focus. The first is the problem of domination, repression, the theme of Marxist political economy. The second is the theme of cohesion or solidarity, what holds a society together, which is the central focus of the mainline sociological theory represented by sociologists like Durkheim or Tönnies. And the third is the least addressed, is the problem which I call the problem of coldness, and which was focused on by social theory to the extent it was addressed at all by sociologists like Max Weber in his studies of the relation between so-called capitalism and religion. The problem of coldness is that as a society becomes more liberal, becomes freer, it also in general becomes colder. And there are many peoples in the world who want to become free without becoming cold. And that presents an entirely different set of problems for which we lack even the vocabulary, much less the ideas and the theories. Now, to address problems like those, problems like the problems suggested by my contrast between the conventional view of an intrinsic logic of technological evolution as applied to artificial intelligence, and the view to which I contrasted it, education or ideas about education, our view about the role of education becomes crucial. And lip service is not enough. Becomes crucial because now the imagination, the informed imagination, the educated imagination, becomes a central agent in the process of the making or remaking of society. So that's just suggesting one of the many ways in which the role of education in the discourse of political economy changes completely. Because now it really, at each step of the way, it matters what the solution will be, what the form of the cognitive empowerment, the imaginative liberation will take. Then we come to this great theme of education, which has been in many countries in the modern world in the last few centuries, a target, a theme of projects of national liberation. So the great educational reformers around the world are hailed as liberators, as was Sarmiento in Argentina. Sarmiento was the president of the Republic at the formative moment of Argentine history. Vasconcelos in 20th century Mexico was at least the Minister of Education. Von Humboldt in Germany, and John Dewey in the United States, not in power, but with immense influence over the direction of elite American education, the so-called progressive education in the United States. So how can we, in this context, in the context about which I've been speaking in the course, engage the theme of education? On what premises and with what direction? And this is where I want to consult you about your ideas on how, in a context of a contemporary society, we can launch a project of education in the spirit of Sarmiento, and the spirit of Dewey, as not a frill, a detail, but a central object of the reconstructive effort. Now the student, the agent of this effort, the young person, we must approach as, in the first place, an agent. Education is all about the enhancement of agency, which is the capacity to act, to turn the tables on the context and transform it, and transform oneself as a result. Second, as a prophet. Every young person is a tongue-tied prophet. And a prophet because the development of the personality is inseparable from the discovery of possibility and empowerment in the world. And then third, as a being with imagination, because imagination is the attribute that connects prophetic power with agency. So this should be a topic which is not just about money, not just about economic growth, but about the development of people, about the creation of the human being with this inner power to stand on his feet and make himself into a real person with a periphery of potential. The setting is nevertheless complicated because the school has to fight for its space in a world which is dominated by three powers: the state, the family, and the university. Now let me begin with the state. The state wants servants. It wants agents who are capable of acting in the existing order. Workers who can dominate the most recent technology and become ever more productive. Citizens who can obey but also discuss and vote the rules. The state doesn't want trouble. The state doesn't want division. It wants production and power. The school has to convince the state that capacity to act within the framework, which is what the state wants, the established framework, the framework now, is in fact inseparable from capacity to see beyond the framework. That the practices, the knowledge, the capabilities of a learning society establish this indissoluble link between capability in the present and capability in the adjacent future. The second power with which the school must contend for its space is the family. Now, Plato presented the radical solution. Take the child away from the family as soon as possible, was Plato's solution. And one has to ask of Plato's solution, to what problem was it intended to be a solution? This isn't clear. But we can say that the family stands for two potential evils. First of all, the family stands for the class system and is the reminder, the daily reminder, day and night, of the presence of the class system as the great social prison in which our fates are arrested. And which Plato himself and the ancient Indians gave a cosmological justification, the system of rebirth. That justified each individual's place in society, his place in the order of caste and of class, by reference to the merits that he had acquired or the transgressions that he had committed. And second, the family stands for the world, for worldliness. And the family rarely desires the child, its child, to wear the crown of thorns and walk the path of Calvary. Even if it's a society which has the religion of sacrificial love, the family doesn't want to see sacrifice imposed on the child. The family wants to protect the child and see the child prosper and flourish in the world. But worldliness is also an enemy of spirit. So the school has to resist the family. And every child has to be rescued from the state and from the family. Now then we come to the third monster in this story. The third monster is the university. The university is the custodian of the Orthodox culture. And all the national curriculums that exist in the world, in most countries, almost not in the United States, which has no real national curriculum. But in almost all other countries, they do have national curriculums. The national curriculum is a kind of infantilization of the orthodoxies of the university culture. The national curriculums that exist in the world are largely a translation of the orthodoxies of the university culture into a form that is regarded as appropriate for assimilation by the young or the very young. So it's a kind of infantilization of the orthodoxies of the university culture. In these orthodoxies, there are two mechanisms that play a prominent role. The first mechanism are forced marriages between methods and subject matter. So, for example, Harvard University used to have something called the core curriculum. The premise of the core curriculum is that the human mind is like an organon with certain dimensions, certain forms of inquiry that are native to the human mind. And each of these forms of inquiry is associated with a discipline, and that each discipline is associated with a method. And the nature of the method is revealed by the way in which the Harvard professors teach it. This was the theme of the core curriculum. So there's an encyclopedia, mental encyclopedia, which encounters its consummate form in the teachings of the Harvard professoriate. And this is what the national curriculums do all over the world. They codify this business, they disseminate it, and they try and impose it on the young. Two mechanisms, I was saying, play a decisive role in the reproduction of these orthodoxies. The first is the forced marriage of method and subject matter. The cardinal example in social science is economics. Economics is not the study of the economy, as you might suppose it is if you had never studied economics. Economics is the study of a method that was developed by the marginalist theoreticians at the end of the 19th century, and which is even today the heart of the dominant economics. Any study of the economy by another method, for example, the writings about the economy by a great social theorist like Max Weber, is not economics. That's not economics. And on the other hand, the application of this method to things, to phenomena that seem to have nothing to do with production and exchange, like romance, that is economics. So this is an extreme form, but it's an extreme form of a pervasive phenomenon. And what must thought do in the presence of these coerced marriages between method and subject matter? It must ask for divorce. It must find a way to study the subject matter from different methodological perspectives, including perspectives that will subvert the dominant one. Another example is the respective roles of structure and history in the life sciences, in natural science. So if you study the way in which physics and the life sciences are taught, you would think physics is all about structure and function. And in fact, it's now progressed to a point in which it has almost entirely banished the concepts of causality and of time. And produces the impression that the truth of its statements is locked in their mathematical formulation. On the other hand, the life sciences, at least in natural history, are based on the opposite premise, that history determines structure, not the other way around. And they are inseparable from the recognition of causality and the recognition of time. this is an accident to a large extent, that we discovered the historical character of the universe a little before the emergence of the now dominant schools of natural science. Rather, it's the opposite, a little after, in the 1920s, whereas the initial form of relativity in quantum mechanics had arisen before. And this has left us with the impression that the affirmation of the historical character of nature is peripheral. It's a detail, it's a curiosity. Cosmology is viewed not as the fundamental natural science, but as a kind of large-scale astronomy. So this is pervasive, this forced marriage between method and subject matter, which makes it seem that every discipline has a method intrinsic to it, a natural method, and that if the subject is not studied by that method, it's not the appropriate study of the subject matter. The second mechanism that is pervasive in the sciences is the suppression, the hiding of the metaphysical content of scientific theories. So we constantly confuse what science has in fact discovered from what the scientists of that science say it has discovered, or say they have discovered. So, for example, the orthodox interpretation of Einstein's theories of special and general relativity incorporates a set of ontological or metaphysical preconceptions through which the empirical findings are read. For example, relativity theory is supposedly vindicated by a series of empirical tests, like the so-called perihelion of Mercury. But these tests read the meaning that is attributed to them only when a metaphysical program is supplied from the outside. That metaphysical program, in the case of relativity theory, includes a quasi-geometrical conception of Riemannian space-time, which is not demonstrated by any empirical finding whatsoever, but which is a philosophical invention. As soon as you begin to study these disciplines, you discover that there are always alternatives to the dominant theories that simply make a different set of philosophical assumptions. So, for example, in relativity theory, time is relative and space is universal. There's a version of so-called shape dynamics in physics in which it's the opposite. Time is universal and space or place is relative, and so forth. Now this is pervasive in all of the sciences. So there are three elements. There's the empirical element, what they in fact find empirically and experimentally. There's the reading of the empirical element through a theoretical framework, which is always a set of categories or concepts. And then there are the long-term research programs. The dominant research program now in natural sciences is anti-temporal and anti-historical. So what is the world really like? It turns out to be a much more complicated question than it first appears. And the message which is to be given to the young then is the message pronounced by these orthodoxies of the university culture, which is this is the reality. Not these are the dominant ideas, but this is what things are really like. So what must be the attitude of the school with respect to university culture? The attitude of the school must be to immunize the students against their susceptibility to these false revelations. The young are emasculated young in their early youth, and then begin this relentless program of instilling in them the orthodoxies of the university culture, of which the school must be a mortal enemy. So the school should deliver the young to the higher stages of education, immunized to the extent that they can be against the servility, the wrong intellectual servility that awaits them in the university and beyond. So, the school must resist the state and induce the young to be troublemakers and heretics. The school must resist the family and its obsession to have the child prosper and shine in the established order. And the school must resist the university, which is the custodian of the established intellectual order. Now, how can this operation be conducted? Because the school, on a democracy in principle, is the voice of the future. But who speaks for the future? Stalin would say, which are the armies of the future? Hic Rhodus, hic salta. This is the reality. You can't jump out of the world. And so this is the first formidable complication that the school must face. It must be like Archimedes with a lever to unsettle the established world. But on the basis of what? From where? From nowhere? So this is an intractable dilemma in which the school finds itself. The school must be for the possible and for the future, in a world that sees the present and the necessary. Now let me address a second set of questions. Which is the political economic framework within which the problem of mass schooling is to be addressed in countries like the United States or like Brazil or like India that are large, unequal, and characteristically federal in structure. The initial challenge is to reconcile the local management of the schools with national standards of investment and quality. Very few countries, and certainly no very large countries, can seek to imitate the examples of a hyper-unitary state like France, where it said that the Minister of Education could look at his watch at any time of day and know what page of Descartes all the students in France were reading. Can't do that. So the schools have to be managed in all the different circumstances of these vast countries. And yet, we have to insist on national standards of quality and investment. The quality of the education that a young person receives must not depend in a democracy on the happenstance of where it is born. Now, of course, this logic, if it were carried consequentially to its limit, would seem impossible to implement, because you would have to say not just to where it was born, but to whom it was born. And they have trouble, the young, in choosing their parents wisely enough. They don't get to do that in the class system. So there are three mechanisms in the contemporary circumstances of these large and unequal states for achieving that result of reconciling national standards with local management. The first mechanism is to see what works and how it works, school by school and student by student, and to do so to the extent possible without the overshadowing presence of these international tests, which are a kind of race to the bottom. So you have to demystify these tests. For example, why does a relatively small country like Finland do so well in the international test? It do so well by a very simple device, which is it focuses large investment on the bottom quintile of every class. And by raising the performance of the bottom quintile, even moderately, it can produce remarkable effects in the international comparison. But that's not good enough. Obviously, you have to have a much more capacious understanding. I'll give you the opposite example from 19th century Germany. Alexander von Humboldt, the founder of the University of Berlin, who was imitated widely in the United States, the American university system, is a copy of the German research universities of the 19th century, not of the English university. Decreed that for several years the students would have no exams. They wouldn't be tested. And he then explained this system of his. The explanation was the following. Under my system, he said, the vast majority of students will waste their time, but a tiny minority of geniuses will prosper and be liberated. And as the destiny of the nation rests entirely on the shoulders of the geniuses, it's necessary to sacrifice the interest of the majority to the interest of this tiny elite. So that was a kind of Republican elitism, which would fare poorly in the current context. But I'm just mentioning as an example of the vast range of possibilities that exist for the solution of this problem. The second instrument for reconciling national standards with local management is a mechanism to redistribute resources and even staff from richer places to poor places. And that should be one of the characteristic responsibilities of experimentalist federalism of the kind I described in an earlier class. Education and economic vanguardism should be two such characteristic responsibilities. And the third mechanism, the third instrument for reconciling national, so it's in the American context, for example, it should be obvious, it's completely incompatible with the dependence of school finance on local municipal finance. It makes no sense in a large federation, a very unequal country, that the main way of financing the public schools is the property tax, which is heavily dependent on place and on class. So the three levels of the federation, federal, state, and municipal, should be associated in trans-federal bodies, and these trans-federal bodies should have powers of intervention and reconstruction. If a local school system repeatedly falls beneath the minimum acceptable level of quality, the trans-federal system should take it over temporarily, delegate its reconstruction to independent reformer, manager, and then return it fixed afterwards. That would be an example. So it's not enough to have a mechanism of redistribution, it's also necessary to have a method of reconstruction, of takeover and reshaping. Now we come to the really hard part, which is what's going to be taught and how is it going to be taught. What I have to say about this, in some respects resembles John Dewey's program, but only half of it, because John Dewey's program was divided by the Americans into two parts. There's the part that they accepted about cooperative analytical problem solving, which is the dominant theme in elite American education, in the top tier of the public schools and in the leading private schools of the country. But there's the other part about criticism and transformation, which the Americans largely rejected. I have the impression that what they replaced it with was the acquisition of a particular style of sociability, which is regarded as useful or even necessary to successful performance in the American professional managerial class. So the young person should be able to cast over his fellows a glow of self-effacing charisma. He should seduce, but at the same time conceal his seduction. And smother the whole operation under an appearance of cheerful and personal friendliness. So the mastery of this form of sociability is the real object of that part of the schooling. So what should be the program of education in a way that abstracts from the important differences between the education of the very young and the education of somewhat older students. First and most importantly, the theme of education should be the study of transformation. Natural and social transformation. To understand a phenomenon, whether it is natural or social, is to grasp how it changes. That's the whole nature of insight. If you observe a phenomenon, if you simply stare at it or rationalize it retrospectively, you haven't understood it. You understand it to the extent that you understand what interventions in the phenomenon would change it and how they would change it, in what direction. That's the gold standard, the acid test of insight into the actual. Insight into the actual is always imagination of the adjacent possible. There is no other insight. In the absence of insight into the adjacent possible, all you have is retrospective rationalization, which is what predominates in the social sciences. And thus most of contemporary social science, in the absence of a theory of regimes, is what the historians of philosophy call right-wing Hegelianism, the rationalization of the real. And this should be the theme everywhere, in all fields. And then also the forced marriages between method and subject matter would be much less likely to survive. So the toolbox, the repertoire of analytic and synthetic capabilities should be marshaled in the service of this insight into transformation. This is the key to the imagination. The imagination, as I've said before, has two moves or two steps. One step is distance from the phenomenon. This is the step that Immanuel Kant emphasized. An image is the memory of a perception. The second step is the subsumption under the phenomenon, under a range of transformative variation, a penumbra of variation in the realm of the proximate possible, not the ultimate or theoretical possible. And that's how we understand, and that's how understanding grows. Now, second attribute of this program, you can say, is how are we to acquire this insight into the actual, shaped by the imagination of the possible? We cannot acquire it encyclopedically. It's not by the domination of encyclopedic and passive knowledge. It's by selective depth. We can't acquire it without content in a vacuum of content, but with respect to content, what matters is never the encyclopedic scope, but the selective deepening. Therefore, a form of education oriented to themes and to projects. Now, third, a rescue and a revision of the idea of a classical education. So what is this idea? This idea is that the young should always be schooled in a form of consciousness and culture, a set of ideas There's not only the ideas of their society and their culture, but of another culture, another society, so that every person has, as it were, a third eye, looking at the present from the standpoint of another form of thinking, another sensibility, remote in space and in time. Now, the idea of the classical education is that this remote thing, which for the Europeans was Greek and Roman antiquity, and for the Chinese was the Confucianist canon, nevertheless had a genealogical relation to the present. So it was both distant and complicitous. Now, what's the problem with the idea of a classical education? The problem is the dogmatic character of the canon. And the dogmatic character of the canon has to be exploded. So there has to be a radical pluralization of the canon, but the ideal is maintained. Now, fourth, the social character or the social setting of the school has to be cooperation. This was a theme that John Dewey emphasized. Teamwork, cooperation among students, between teachers and students, among teachers, among schools, between in-presence and remote learning, and so forth. Cooperation is the method of advanced science. The problem of advanced science is revealed by Thomas Kuhn's distinction between normal science and revolutionary science. So in that distinction, the idea is there are these lonely pinnacles of genius, Aristotle, Newton, Einstein, and in between them there's the banausic, routinized, low-level mediocrity of ordinary science, which is the collective and cooperative enterprise. It's this distinction that has to be relativized. By a form of scientific practice that dissolves the forced marriages and reveals the hidden philosophical content of the dominant scientific theories. It makes routine science more complicated, more challenging, more open to the imagination, and relativizes the distinction between the ordinary and the genius. Remembering always what genius is. Genius is not a kind of superintelligence. It's not a form of power. Genius is a form of vision. That was the meaning of Schopenhauer's statement. The talented person is like an archer who hits a target that others cannot hit, whereas a genius is like an archer who hits a target that others cannot see. So cooperative and collective science, open to its philosophical content, revealed to be more full of possibility and contradiction than it reveals, is then the climate in which this relativization of the peaks and the valleys is likely to advance. And finally, all education must be dialectical. Given that in this system we renounce the idea of encyclopedic coverage, we have time. And we have time to study everything at least twice from opposing points of view. Nothing, absolutely nothing, should be taught just once from one point of view. The dialectic is the only way, is the only form of intellectual liberation. So that would be the general character of the curriculum. I described it in this list as an account of general education. Now, what is the account of practical or vocational education that corresponds to it? It's not the old German model, widely imitated in the world, machine-specific and profession-specific competences. It's a study focused on the generic, theoretical, cognitive, and practical capabilities required for the operation of the reprogrammable machine tools of the contemporary knowledge economy. And the result will be to relativize the contrast between the old European opposition between general education for the elites and practical education or vocational training for the masses, for the workers. Now I want to turn the discussion to, as I said I wanted to, as I would, to this question of how we can launch such a project in a real country, in a real contemporary country today, as a project of national liberation, which is what the great projects of educational reform were always thought to be. The reformers of education were celebrated in their countries as liberators and reinventors of their countries, of their nations, because they then gave to the masses a power that they lacked and set them on this stream of spiritual strength. Now I say, how are we to do this? It can't be done by an ideologist, although such a form of education does need its ideologist. It can't be done by a little clique, by a coterie at the center, by a despot, like von Humboldt. It has to be done by thousands of teachers and hundreds of schools. And how? How is it to be done in the practical conditions of the contemporary society? It does need a discourse, a narrative. And the discourse has to be presented in multiple forms. Some of them demanding, others popular. But with the intention of producing excitement, enthusiasm, and mass engagement. And there is a problem which has been evoked always in all the discussions I've had about this topic in my own country and in other countries. One topic keeps recurring. The topic is the following. No matter what you propose, no matter what you think, when it's going to be translated into the reality of the teachers, teaching as they teach, I mean, if we try and radically change the way they are educated, all of your pedagogic ideas are going to be tortured by mediocrity. And what's really going to happen is not what you're proposing, and it looks so beautiful on the page, but what's going to come out from this torture session after it's put into practice. So I propose we begin right there, because that's the problem that any practical person would immediately think of. And though it's a very simple problem, it's actually one of the hardest problems to deal with. What do you think? You have I laid out a project in its several parts. And now I'm addressing its implementation, the agency of it. And in particular, I've evoked this problem of the torture of mediocrity. Meanwhile, we have all these hostile forces in the corner waiting to register our fate. There's a university representing the villains of orthodoxy and necessity. There's a state with its hunger for war and wealth. And then there's the family, speaking for the world and for worldliness. So we already have all of these enemies. And then what we attempt to do is we're now going to be tortured by mediocrity and left in the shriveled form and not in the shining form in which we imagined it. What should we do about this? Yes.
Okay.
You have to, they tell me you have to keep pressing it.
Okay, I'll keep pressing it. I guess I'm struggling to imagine a society that's kind of devoid of these like ontological and epistemological preconceptions of some of our most tightly held scientific beliefs without descending into like scientific positivism or this kind of anarchy of problematic dysregulation. Like I just am struggling to conceptualize where the line lies.
And so what's the question then?
Kind of where does the line lie between disabusing ourselves of ontological or epistemological prejudices, then not descending into some sort of anarchy of scientific positivism. Like, how do you not? I mean, how do you get rid of what you can call ontological?
Well, you can't get rid of it. The point is not to get rid of it. The point is to recognize it. The point is not to say, so the idea of which I spoke is the notion that in a complicated science, it's not just two elements, theory and empiricism. The three elements. There's the discoveries that the scientists made. Then how they make sense of those discoveries. They make sense of them in relation to an idea like Newton's universe of forces and billiard balls hitting each other, fields. And then there are the overtly philosophical conceptions. So there's always an implicit metaphysic in all the sciences. And it's vital to ferret out the implicit metaphysic. We can't abolish it. It's not like it was a poison that we have to get rid of it. We can't get rid of it. The empirical findings don't speak for themselves. There has to be a categorical structure. The categorical structure comes from somewhere. It depends on some set of ontological presuppositions. The point is not to abolish it, but to reveal it so we can control it, control for it. That was the point I was making. Now, let me say by way of extending that, that in the programmatic argument of this course, I have opposed two crises in our understanding of the world. One much more directly, and more directly related to our subject matter than the other. But let me, again, restate what they are. So the first is that we do not now have a credible and usable theory of regimes. That goes to the heart of our subject, of our discussion here. So by theory of regimes, I mean this was the heart of Western social thought for 2,500 years, since Aristotle. Then in modern thought, Montesquieu and Marx are two culminating moments in the theory of regimes. So it's a theory of the basic structure of a society. How this structure is composed, what its nature is, where it comes from, how it changes. That is the supreme object of intellectual ambition in social thought. And the supreme object of practical political ambition is the defense or the transformation of the regime. So together these are the main objects of ambition, of political ambition, theoretical and practical. Now, our problem is we don't have a theory of regimes now. The last consummate theory of regimes was Karl Marx's theory of society and history, which depends on that whole apparatus of thinking that there are a menu of modes of production, that each of them is an indivisible system, which is either falls or stands as a whole, and that there are laws governing the operation of each of them and their foreordained succession in history. If you believe all of that, you have to think that there are basically two kinds of politics. There's a reformist politics that manages these systems, and there's a revolutionary politics that replaces one by another. And we can't really have programs or projects because history has a project for us. So the whole idea of having a project is a form of idealizing voluntarism. It's an illusion. And I tried to argue throughout that the detailed questions like the theory of agency are inseparable from this. So the Marxist theory of agency is the more class conflict there is, the more perspicuous the objective character of the interests of each class is. The content of class interest is revealed by the intensification of class conflict. It's an objective content. The punishment for misunderstanding it is political defeat. I think that's the exact opposite of the truth. And that as conflict intensifies over the structure, the question, what are my interests as a member of a certain class, becomes less and less separable from the question, what are the proximate alternatives? And what would I become under each of those alternatives? And who would my friends and who would my enemies then be? So these fundamental questions. So it is a crisis in the social sciences that we don't have a theory of regimes now. All we have is the vocabulary of theories of regimes in which we no longer believe. One of them, Marxism. And this confuses all of our discussions. Now the second crisis is the crisis that arises in the natural sciences. And it's a crisis in which began long ago in the quantification of the natural sciences by Galileo and his contemporaries, but it's now reached a culminating point. The natural sciences and physics, the gold standard is particle physics, have now developed to the point at which they have subverted or dispensed with the ideas of causation, being replaced by function, of change, and history. So history is dominated by structure. And there is a basic set of ultimate constituents of the world described by particle physics. And there are the ultimate laws, symmetries, or constants of nature that govern these basic constituents of the world. If that is true, there is then a fundamental discrepancy between our experience and this picture of what the world is like. Because in our experience, we can't pull out the thread of time. Time is inseparable from our experience. So a world without time, a world without change, a world without causation is not our world. It's not our world that we can recognize as our own. If basic physics then gives us a narrative of the world in that acausal and atemporal language, it's describing a world from which we must be forever exiled. It's not a world that communicates with us. And now, it may nevertheless be what the world is really like. We don't have a basis to say that's not what the world is like. But it would have momentous consequences for us if that's what the world turned out to be. So, what I do say in the arguments about the natural sciences is that what we now know is not enough to assert that the world is like that. We don't have the basis to exclude it, but there are too many other intellectual possibilities. That possibility leads to the conclusion that the truth of the basic natural sciences is locked up in their mathematical formulation, which is by its very nature an atemporal and acausal formulation. And that every non-mathematical formulation is a metaphorical popularization of the truth. Now, is that the situation? I think no one ever decided, there was never any meeting of the great physicists of the world which they decided this is what the world is like. We got that way in these little steps from the 16th century on. But now we've reached the point at which that's what it is. And you take a science like cosmology, which is a historical science. Cosmology is a historical science. And the normal thing would be to say it is the fundamental natural science. How can it not be the fundamental natural science? If the universe is historical, everything in it must be historical. But instead, it's treated as marginal and as a kind of large-scale astronomy. So, what philosophy can do is not to say that's wrong. What philosophy can do is say, look what the consequences of this are. And ask yourself whether it's really necessary to think that way. What's the alternative to thinking that way and so forth. That's what a more skeptical natural science, open to the surprises and possibilities of experience, would do. So So all of that would be part of the content of education, not in the high-flown form in which I just stated it, but the message that the young would receive from the school would be that message. And that's a different culture. The culture that we're inhabiting. So the culture that we're inhabiting is a culture in which, here we are, we have this world in which a tiny elite controls the vanguard of production and productivity. The states of the world are at each other's throats. We're slaughtering one another now for the last several hundred years, and we're probably going to continue until we've annihilated ourselves. And meanwhile, the world, the real world, turns out to be entirely indifferent to us. And it's not even, you think that your life is in time, you're going to die, everything human is temporal. But nature is like the waves of the sea coming and going, and it has no relation to that stuff. So this is a second crisis in our understanding of the world. The alternative to it is not some narrative that tells a feel-good story. The alternative is that our understanding, that the language in which we explain nature be translatable into the language of human experience. The earth is flat. The earth seems to be flat, but in fact it's round. So we can handle these discrepancies between what it appears to be and what it is. But to say that time is an illusion, that there is no time, is an entirely different story. And from that blow, we cannot recover. So I think that one of the many reasons why the theme of education is so interesting is that it's not just about us. It's about the way in which we come to construct these representations of the whole world. And about the formation of people who have this power. The power to press on these two crises that I just described, for example. And say, here are the alternatives, here's what we can do. Here are forms of imaginative intellectual action, which don't initially present themselves to us. This is freedom. This is life. To have this power of resistance. And not just to be left in a situation of helpless victims of an intellectual catastrophe which we are unable to comprehend. But what do you all think about this question of, my experience is, in a country like my country, which is a fairly characteristic country of the contemporary world situation, it's a large country, big and equal, one of the most unequal countries in the history of the world. In which, like in the United States, paradoxically, the majority of ordinary people continue to think that everything is possible. How do they think that's a mystery? They're nailed to the cross of their, not just of their genetic, but of their social fates in a class system which is one of the most hierarchical in the history of the world. And they think everything is possible. They have the religion of life. there's no project that's gonna have a national dimension if it doesn't reach a threshold at which it becomes a dominant national narrative. And I think that to catch fire, it has to be experienced as a narrative of liberation. It can't be experienced in the same way by people who are poorly educated and poor and elites, so there has to be a whole spectrum of ways of interpreting it. But it has to be a narrative that seduces, that convinces, and that is embodied in individuals who appear in their country as people who are trying to save the country. Then it'll be ridiculed. He's the savior of the country. But that's what's necessary. But what can be done to make this implausible activity less implausible? So traditionally, education in my country, traditionally, the country is very anarchic. And the traditional schooling was like a campaign, a military campaign which we directed against ourselves. So Brazil is anarchic. We're going to choose the country in the world that's least anarchic in its school system. It's going to be France. And we're going to educate every young Brazilian as if you were a 19th century French child. In the encyclopedia, the dogma. It's an operation directed against our tendencies. That's what the traditional schooling was. And now, of course, the elites get to go to schools that are imitations of American schools. And you know what that is. It has advantages and disadvantages of this system. In its best versions, it's like half of John Dewey's program, without the inconvenient other half. So it's in part an educational program, and in part a form of enforced socialization into the culture and habits of another country, another society, the United States. Meanwhile, we have 80 million Protestant evangelicals who have been wheeled into the country in a very short space of time, like in a Trojan horse. The Trojan horse is full of Americans. That's a third of the country. And all the political events of recent years in Brazil are a direct consequence. So we're on these waves. So to make it less accident prone, the people have to be educated. They have to be able to think, to criticize. Apart from this or that government, they have to have this power of agency. And that's easy to ridicule my discourse, the prophetic discourse, because it invites this idea of megalomania. But the problem is that unless it has an incendiary element, it doesn't seduce. Yes?
Yeah, so I have like a follow-up question. We talked a lot about education today,
Yeah.
so how to form the self-empowered individual or
Yeah.
group. But like beyond that, it strikes me there's additional requirements for civil society to organize itself, right? So what are the organizational formats? Like traditionally, we have a lot of NGOs, which is kind of a professional vehicle, which is providing services to civil society.
Yeah,
But what are
well,
different
that
kinds
was
of
what I was
organizations?
going to talk about next time.
Okay.
But, so I think that it's not just all about politics in the state, and then there's education, it's the outside. There's a third setting, which is the self-organization of civil society, outside the state and outside the market. And it has certain natural focal points that would instigate it. I think one of them is the provision of public services, about which I spoke earlier in the course. Public services should be, we shouldn't have, as the only model of public services in the world, administrative Fordism, by which I mean the administrative counterpart to industrial Fordism, which is the provision of low-quality services, including the services of education, of lower quality than the equivalent services that might be bought on the market by someone with money, provided by the bureaucratic apparatus of the state. And the only alternative to that seems to be the outright privatization of public service. The state should provide the floor, the ceiling, but in between, there should be a vast area in which the state partners with independent, organized civil society, acting not for profit through cooperatives, and offering alternative models of the provision of public service. I think that's one space. Another space for the self-organization of civil society is social service. Every able-bodied young person should have at least two positions in the society. A position in the production system and a position in the skilling system, or the caring system, take care of people. Everyone dispensed from military service should be subject to mandatory social service. And every young person should spend a certain amount of time at the beginning of his life helping to build a country in collaboration with the members of other social classes in some other part of the country from where he lives. So the universalization of, so military service should never be done by mercenaries under the Republican principle. The army should always be the nation in arms and not part of the country paid by the other parties to defend them, the other parts. The nation in arms, and those who are not in military service, because we don't need all of them, should receive rudimentary military training to compose a reserve, a national reserve, and they should perform a social service in another part of the country. So that's a second example. We have a whole list of these forms in which the provision of public services, the mandatory social service, which are instigations to the organization of civil society, outside the state and outside politics. But it is also true at the same time, because we're speaking about cooperation and trust, and transformation of the moral background of production, that the most important lessons are the lessons that come from the everyday experience of the economy, from how the economy is run. Conventional is a low-form command and control form of production. The new vanguard isn't. The new Vanguard requires a heightening of the level of trust and reciprocal discretion. It's a transformation of the moral background. The social service. Now, all of these are challenges. We have that law, that all young Brazilians are subject to mandatory social service. The officers of the Army, the generals told me, and they were absolutely right. I didn't turn this on. The government, they could do that. They could send the bourgeois youth of Sao Paulo to work for a year or two in the Amazon. They could do anything. So it's claiming a power that we didn't have. It's part of the law, but it's a dead part. So we should continue next week. I have to leave now early. But next week I'm going to stay after class so we can discuss the papers.
Okay, for the discussion section, I would say 5 minutes break, and then we reconvene in the front room.
I was just going to ask you, George,
Hey, Felix. Yeah.
Any idea what the scope of the deal is?
I wish I could give more detailed information. I'm also doing it for the first time.
Yeah, that's
so,
what I thought you were saying.
it's the same knowledge as symmetry, I would say. But generally, as far as I understand, it's a very open format. It was posted now on Canvas, I think. I don't know if you saw this version.
No, I don't think it is.
So basically, it's just like outlining like the institution proposal of your liking in any given jurisdiction, which that doesn't have to one adopt like Professor Ingres programmatics, but like kind of the philosophy, how to think through experimentalism, progressive change, and these kind of elements.
Good, that's good.
But it can be pretty much
Pretty loose. Yeah. And how long?
I think it's like around 3,000 words or something.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah.
It's like a bad cough.
Yeah. It's pretty straightforward.
Yeah, okay, cool.
But I think we can answer the questions. We'll answer the next time as well.
Okay. Yeah, no,
Mine was pretty straight.
I wanted to kind of do that anyway, so that's perfect.
Perfect. Well,
Yeah.
what's your program?
Well, I don't know, I'm from New Zealand, and
Okay.
yeah, there's a lot of scope kind of do some of these things in New Zealand. So it's one of the only places in the world that can actually
Right.
kind of make changes rapidly. So I think there's kind of interesting aspects of what it is.
I lived in New Zealand for half a year when I was like a teenager.
Oh, really? How come? The amount, yeah. That'd be perfect. Do you want to exchange or?
Yeah, it's the exchange during high school.
Yeah, my brother, one of my brothers lives in Christchurch, and they have German students
Right.
at the moment. They've been for like maybe 3 or 4 years. They're just constantly rotating students coming through for 6 months. Yeah.
Yeah, it's
And they never want to leave. Yeah.
exchange.
Yeah, it's a good deal, right? Yeah.
What program are you using in Harvard?
Oh, right. So that's what you meant. Yeah. So I'm doing the mid-career HKS.
Oh, good HS.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'm good.
Oh, cool.
And the MBA program.
Cool. Yeah, yeah. I started mine in 2022,
Okay.
and then my wife had a baby, so paused my ran for Parliament in New Zealand.
Okay, wow.
Now I've come back,
Yeah.
and then I've got like 3 courses to finish.
Cool. So you're doing this semester and then you're...
And then I'm going back to run again. Yeah.
Okay,
But I've been living in the US in the meantime.
Right. Okay.
It's just, life took over again. And
Yeah.
yeah.
Nice. So you have another 4 weeks as well?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, it goes by like every
It's crazy. Yeah.
Did you enjoy it? Like, what's your specialization? Are you focused on your work also?
Yeah, so I work for, I did work for the United Nations, and then I work for something called the UN Foundation. But fortunately, I work for this place called the UN Foundation, which is kind of separated out. It's like a domestic US institution, but it's the, it's like the formal foundation kind of charitable giving arm of the UN. So it's an odd kind of offshoot of it. But yeah, and then I was a New Zealand diplomat for 10 years before joining the UN. So it's,
Okay, wow.
yeah.
And now you're planning to stay in the US or?
Well, no, because running for Parliament.
Oh, yeah, go back now.
Yeah. Again, so I ran in a very conservative seat last time. This time, so I was away from class for 3 weeks because I was back in New Zealand.
Well, then you can write your program proposal for...
Yeah, exactly, exactly. That's basically it.
Just overthrow
Good
everything and build
Exactly, that would be his formula.
I just have to prepare now the discussion section.
Yeah, of course.
But, to grab a coffee or something.
Yeah, that'd be lovely. Yeah, nice to meet you.
What's his name?
George. Felix. Yeah.
Felix, yes. Perfect.
I'll spin that. I'll spin everything response on you, and then be like, so first, what do you think about it? And then you're gonna be.
I forget really what my main key takeaway from it was, but it was an interesting topic, the guy that wrote about it, so I don't know. It's also
How's it going? Guys, you want to come to the first row?
Yeah.
Let's see then.
I'm adding a picture real quick
Okay.
to the slides because I forgot.
Okay, I'll update them real quick. But that's not cool.
I'm thinking maybe next week.
It's just a picture from the economics lab.
Ah, cool. Okay, roll.
Just in the front.
Yeah, I'm not sure if he's gonna be here.
So it's in-
No. It's sure it's like not appropriate.
Is it?
Is that all right?
Yeah.
Shit, I don't know. It doesn't work again, I think.
All you had to do
Nice.
is turn it off and on.
Yeah, brute force sometimes works. Oh. Come on.
Sorry.
So it always works when I plug it out. And then it switches back to this. How do you want to try to plug in your computer directly? There's something wrong with my settings. Oh. I think you can just, we have a USB-C, otherwise you can. doesn't work, you can log in.
Yeah.
Okay, so you want to come a bit more to the front so we can see a bit more of an intimate setting? Right. Maybe get started while Conor is setting up his presentation. First of all, I owe you an apology. I realized at the beginning of this lecture that I didn't actually send out the email with the discussion forms, although I had something prepared. Promise, but I can imagine that you were also holidays and probably were quite happy of having extra readings. Right, so I think we will start with Conor's presentation today. He prepared a pretty cool case study on the post-growth movement or the degrowth movement. So I would suggest we spend the first 30 minutes as always discussing and unpacking his case and then jumping into a discussion on civil society, the role within Unger's thinking, and then maybe we can unpack a little bit the elements we discussed today. So what is an empowered agent, like what are the key characteristics maybe of such a person or a group of people, and how can we think about institutions that empower such people, including education, but I think it would be also interesting to expand that conversation actually to other institutional arrangements that are enabling a self-organized civil society. Cool, okay, without further ado, over to you.
Yes.
Yeah.
So my case study was on the degrowth movement. It isn't really a big movement, so I couldn't find any relevant photos other than the snail, which is a big symbol, because basically it believes in slowing down or reversing the paradigm of economic, infinite economic growth. Yeah, so like I was saying, the degrowth movement has its roots in the question, is no growth or degrowth, which is necessary for ecological and societal prosperity, an option under our current capitalistic system, which is the infinite economic growth paradigm. It started in the 1970s in France, kind of fizzled out, and then got rekindled as a way of thinking in Spain, and then Italy, and then France again in the early 2000s. It's focused on critiquing the capitalist system. Its primary goal is to encourage the government to pursue ecological and societal well-being, including redistribution of resources and economic resources, a reduction of the global economy. So it also is a reduction of globalism, which is what we're going to talk about in the next with Unger, and then a shift towards class solidarity and autonomy, particularly poorer classes and the working class, and less emphasis on the richer classes. So the primary challenge is the primary challenge is the current way of thinking concerning economic resource gathering, production, and cultivation in general. They believe that current practices harm the environment, which is fueled by that way of thinking. They believe that to solve this means we have to also solve societal problems more broadly. So like wealth inequality, education inequality. They also believe that the ecological harms that are coming from unsustainable economic growth harm minorities and marginalized groups more than rich people and non-marginalized